If you've come across Common Lisp, you might have noticed how weird and interesting it is. It's a pretty amazing language, but it's been around for a while now. I thought, why don't we try building a web app in 2024 and see if it can still hold up? I'm going to be using Common Lisp today, which, depending on how you count, is 30 or 40 years old. Common Lisp is actually just a specification, so we need to pick an implementation of a compiler that actually can translate Common Lisp code into something that can be executed for us. One of the more popular ones is SBCL, Steelbag Common Lisp, and we're going to be using that today. Now, what we're going to do today is we just define a simple web service in Common Lisp and deploy that to Fly.io. Now, Fly, if you're not familiar, is basically a service that you'll just give your Docker image to and they just deploy it for you. It's pretty straightforward to use, that's why I'm using it today, but it should work with any service that can deploy a Docker image for you. And there shouldn't be any difference between the platforms. I'll be using VS Code just to keep things simple. Emacs has really good support for Lisp code in general, but I think Visual Studio Code is quite a nice entrance to get started. To make our life easier, I'm going to be installing an extension called Alive, which will just help us with code completion as well as executing code into a REPL. So the first thing I want to do is search in VS Code for Alive and install that. I already set up SBCL on my computer here, as well as QuickLisp, which is a package manager that you can use in Common Lisp to install additional things. You can actually see it down here being used. Alive needs a few dependencies that you need to install just so they're available locally, and Alive will then make use of them to provide you with help while you code. Let's just start with a blank folder for now. So I just created a folder called Fly Server in the path QuickLisp local projects in my home folder. That's kind of a predefined folder structure coming from QuickLisp. It'll just make sure that if you try to load that project later, that system that we'll define, QuickLisp will be able to find it. So let's open that. We'll just start from blank. And in here we're going to add our first file. So the first thing we want to do is declare our system, as I called in Common Lisp. You can think of it as a package in other languages. Now the first thing we want to do is create and define our system. So we just do that by creating a file. I'll just call it the same as the folder and use the extension ASD. An ASD file is being used by ASDF, which is the way to define systems or packages in Common Lisp. And in there we'll just fill out a few basic things. So I'll be using ASDF dev system Fly Server. We can now define a bunch of metadata if we want to. I'm not going to do that. I'll just keep it very simple. And basically we can have a depends on key that later on defines dependencies that have to be installed for the system to be usable. And probably more important right now is the components key. In there, we'll say our components consist of files and source, which is a subdirectory, it has to be a string. And in there we want to define that we have only a single file called server. That's it, that's our basic configuration. Let's just create now the actual structure that we just defined. So we have a source folder and a file called server.lisp. Great, now in here we're going to define our package we're in, and that's going to be Fly Server. We're just going to stick to that. In there we can say what kind of dependencies we want to import into the current namespace. The only thing we want to do now is say use CL. That'll just make sure that all the Common Lisp functions are actually available here. And we're going to say we want to export a function that's called main.fn. It's going to be our entry point later. Now the next thing is we need to actually say that we're in that package now that we just defined. Otherwise we'll be defining all functions in the default namespace. So we're now in the package Fly Server. And let's define our main function straight away. So we do that. We don't take any arguments for now. And in there we're just going to call it format function, which in our case, we're just going to use to print something on standard out. Format takes an argument that defines if it's going to print on standard out or just return it. We do want to print on standard out, so we just put in t as the first parameter, and then put in a string hello world. Great, that's our file. And now what we can do is actually open our REPL that we just set up with alive and see this whole code in action. So down here we have the option REPL focus on REPL view, and that will just open that window down there. And that's just a active common Lisp prompt. We can just do quick test here. Okay, great, that works. And alive gives us a few key bindings that we can use to actually send down code to the REPL. So what I'm going to do now is basically, I can say Alt-Shift-L, and that'll basically send the whole file to the REPL down there. You can see it actually compiled it as well. And what should be possible now is, because we exported our main function earlier, if we now say fly server main function, it'll just say hello world. Great. Now the next thing we're going to do is define our web app in here, and we're going to be using Clack and Hunchentute for it, which is two pretty popular options in Common Lisp. So the first thing we do is go back to our ASD file, and in here we're going to say use Clack and also add Hunchentute. And we're just going to leave our main function for now. We're going to come back to it in a minute. And first, let's define our handler here. So our handler is a function that will be called on for every single request coming from a client. So we're just going to say define handler is going to take a parameter called env, and we're just going to return something static for now, which is 200, which is status code. Nil is for any additional headers. We don't really want to add any currently. And the last parameter is a list that represents the body. So in here we just say hello world, and that's our handler. So the only thing left now for us to do is actually start up Clack. Clack will automatically pick Hunchentute per default unless you specify something else, so we don't actually need to do a lot here. So we just say def parameter Clack app, and we're going to be calling on Clack up, pass in our handler, and we're going to say bind to 0000. Per default, it will just bind to localhost, which won't help us later when we deploy to fly. Now, currently it actually complains that it can't find Clack. That's because it hasn't evaluated it yet to load that dependency. We're just going to load it here for now to actually be able to get some autocomplete here. So now that it's loaded, the warning goes away, and also we should get some helpful information on hovering over particular parts of the code. Now let's evaluate this piece of code, which we can do with Alt-Shift-E, and it's just going to warn us, okay, variable env is defined but never used, that's fine. And the next thing we want to evaluate is our def parameter here, which will start Clack and hopefully will make the server available. It's now saying listening on port 5000 to any incoming address. So if we go back now to the browser, and if we open our localhost 5000, you can see hello world. Beautiful. So that's working great. Now the next thing we want to do is package this whole thing up into a Docker image. So let's create a new file, a Docker file, and in there we're gonna start off the Alpine image just to keep it nice and small. I know we're going to be using version 3.19.0, and we're going to run apk-add sbcl for obvious reasons, as well as curl. We're going to be using curl because we want to install a quick Lisp. So let's do that first. I'm just going to copy over the quick Lisp URL here, curl-o. So that gets us the quick Lisp code, And the only thing now we need to do is copy over our source code into root common Lisp fly server. Now you can see that this path here again is recognized by quick Lisp, just to make sure that SBCL will be able to find our package later when we want to execute it. Now the next thing we want to do is actually loading our system straight away while we're building. The reason for that is so we don't, when the code later executes, we then start fetching dependencies. We want to fetch dependencies while we're building, just so they're cached later on. So we're going to run SBCL. We're going to be loading quicklisp.lisp. I'm going to say it's non-interactive, so it doesn't expect any input and also won't wait at the end for anything to happen. It will just exit. And we then want to evaluate quick Lisp quick start install, and we want to evaluate QL quick load fly server. Now the first thing, as you can imagine, we'll actually set up quick Lisp just so it's available and is aware of all the path. And then we're going to try to load our fly server, which in turn will make sure that all the dependencies are being fetched and installed correctly. The only thing left now is to say what's our entry point. And the entry point actually looks quite similar. So we're going to say command and say SBCL. Again, it's non-interactive. We're loading again quick Lisp dot Lisp, and actually I should setup.lisp, not quick Lisp, and that's in root quick Lisp. Then I just added a line break here, and we want to eval QL quick load fly server, just as we did above. And the only other thing we want to do is eval our main function that we declared before. Fly server main.main-fn. Great. So that's our Docker file defined. That should hopefully work. So let's give it a go. So we're just building our Docker image now. I just added a few more backslashes here. I forgot them earlier, otherwise Docker is a bit confused what these strings are supposed to mean. And I missed a comma here. Great. Now let's try out our new image. So as we saw earlier, it's going to be listening to port 5000. I'll just make sure it listens to a different one locally and see what happens. Right, so we just ran into an error here, and that's kind of expected because what's currently happening here is if we just run clack and clack up, what will happen, it will spawn up a new thread. The problem is that new thread will mean that the prompt will not be blocking. So what we need to do here is add a use thread property and set that to nil. So if we now rebuild our image, now we actually need to make a change in our current code, because as you can see here, we're just starting the server inline. That's not ideal because during our build process, as we saw earlier, we're actually loading already this code. So if this will be here blocking, it will just block the build process itself. Now, for some reason, as you saw, it actually worked before, and the reason for that is because Clack per default actually spins up a new thread and runs the code in that new thread. Which is not ideal, because when we actually do want to execute the server, we want to run this in a blocking way, so SBCL doesn't exit, but instead waits for the server to finish. So what we can do is move this whole piece into our main function, and pass in a parameter that's called useThread and set that to nil. So if we now save the code and rebuild it, great, our image is built now, so let's run it. So it's telling us it's listening on port 5000. We know that it's mapping to port 5001 on the current system. So let's have a look at the browser and see how it's doing. So this is our current server running locally. So if we open your tab and open this one now, we see Hello World, and it's working as expected. Great. Now the only missing piece is to deploy this to Fly. So let's get our terminal and navigate to Quick Lisp local projects Fly server. So we're just going to run Fly launch in here. Detect that we're using a Docker file, and we don't want to change these settings. These are fine. So it's just going to build our image now and hopefully deploy it. Great, so Fly now tells us it has been deployed successfully. So if we now take our link that we get here and go back to the browser and navigate now to our newly deployed service, you see here, okay, great, hello world, and it's working how I expected. Great, so we have deployed our service. It's working. It's actually very few lines of code that we ended up writing. So if you go back to our Fly server, to our server.list file, the only thing we had to define is our handler here, and then say that Clack actually starts this or uses this handler. In here, we get this end parameter, and that end parameter contains a request body, request headers, and everything like that. And we can obviously return anything here dynamically as we want. Yeah, so that's how to deploy a web service in Common Lisp in 2024.